Morning, Valenzuelanos. Are you ready to learn, relearn, and unlearn? I am your teacher, Proceso B. Binsol III, for Disaster Readiness and Risk Reduction, Week 4, entitled Recognizing and Differentiating Elements of Exposure and Vulnerabilities. For your attendance, kindly comment your name and school where you came from on the comment section below. At the end of the lesson, you are expected to recognize the vulnerabilities of different elements exposed to specific hazard, differentiate among hazards, exposure, and vulnerabilities, and explain the relationship of the three to the disaster risk. Before we proceed to our lesson, here are some important reminders. Number 1, prepare your learning materials like pens, papers, pencils, and your learning module. Number 2, listen carefully to the lesson presentation of the teacher. And number 3, participate in the class discussion. To start our lesson, we will have a simple activity entitled Jam Word. Are you ready? Okay, let's go! As you can see, there are jumbled letter words above each image. Unscramble the jumbled letter words to reveal the words associated to the lesson. You are given 5 seconds to write your answer on the comment box below. For the first word and image, timer starts now. Okay, yes, it's risk. Good job. Now for the second image. Timer starts now. You're correct. It's hazard. Amazing. And now for the third image. Timer starts now. Yes, it's vulnerability. Bravo! And for the fourth and final word. Timer starts now. Yes, it's disaster. Fantastic! What are those words unscrambled that are related to the discussion? Yes, we have risk, hazard, vulnerability, and disaster. Now, let us go on to the lesson. Let's define first what hazard is. Hazard is a potentially physical destructive phenomenon like landslides and earthquakes. Aside from that, hazard is also a harmful condition, substance, human behavior, or condition that can cause loss of life, injury, or other health effects, harm to property, loss of lives and services, social and economic disruption, or damage to the environment. Any risk which is imminent is a threat. Now, these are the following images which are seen here. Image number 1. This describes air and water contamination or pollutants that can cause widespread diseases and harm to the environment. Image number 2. This represents electrical hazards such as faulty or octopus wiring. Image number 3. Chemical contamination or chemical spill. Now, let us define what exposure is. Exposure, the location, attributes, and value of assets that are important to communities, such as people, buildings, factories, farmland, and so on and so forth. And that could be affected by a hazard. Exposure is also elements that include the individuals, households or communities, properties, buildings and structure, agricultural commodities, livelihoods, and public facilities. infrastructure and environmental assets present in an area that are subject to potential damage or even losses. The more a community is exposed to the hazard factors, the higher is the disaster risk or higher chance that disaster occurrence may take place. Now, let us define what is vulnerability. Vulnerability. It is the likelihood that assets will be damaged, destroyed, affected when exposed to a hazard. Vulnerability also comprises conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes, which increase the susceptibility of a community, school, or a certain area in a locality to the impact of hazards. Example are the first image are houses near coastal areas that are prone to tsunamis and even storm surges. The next picture are high-rise buildings with many floors, which is also susceptible to earthquakes. Next, describe the characteristics and circumstances of a community system or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. Now, in the next image, this is an image of houses that were totally destroyed during the Super Typhoon Yolanda in 2008, leaving the structure totally damaged. Another image. This is the 1990 earthquake in North Luzon, when a lot of people were injured and died. This was the Hyatt Hotel in Baguio. Now, let us go now to the aspects of vulnerability. In the first image, poor design and construction of buildings. Example of this is the image here of a destroyed building because of an earthquake. Why do you think this building was destroyed? Maybe because of poor constructional design and substantial materials it is made of. Next, inadequate protection of assets. Inadequate protection of assets, this includes overspending and improper or mismanagement of funds, mainly due to corruption. Another one, number 3, lack of public information and awareness. Information dissemination is important in preparing for natural disasters and calamities. That's why we are conducting drills. For example, earthquake drills and fire drills in school, so that we are properly prepared. Then, next is limited official recognition of risk and preparedness measures, and disregard for wise environmental management. In this picture, we are showing here is the picture or an image of a landfill or dump site, wherein the garbage were not properly segregated. That's why we need proper garbage segregation in order for us to save our environment. Now, let me present to you a picture. This is a typical raised house that can be found in Pampanga area. It was affected by lahar. You know lahar, this is the mud flow. The frame of the house, including the foundation, is made with reinforced concrete and hollow block in fill walls. The roof system consists of a coconut lumber frame and galvanized iron material. The partitions are constructed from wooden materials. The house was designed and constructed by a foreman with no formal engineering or architectural background and training. There are 7 people who live inside of this house, which include the owner, who is 34 years old, his 32-year-old wife, and 3 children, ages 5, 3, and 6 months. There is also a 72-year-old female and 40-year-old male who are in a wheelchair bound. Most of the furnishings in this house is made with either wood or plastic. There are 5 aspects in vulnerability. What do you think are these 5 aspects of vulnerability? Here are the different aspects of vulnerability. Number 1, poor design and construction of buildings. Number 2, inadequate protection of assets. Number 3, lack of public information and awareness. Number 4, limited official recognition of risk and preparedness measures. And number 5, disregard for wise environmental management. Now, let us go on to vulnerabilities of different elements that are determined due to its exposure to particular and specific hazard. These are the following. Physical vulnerability. Number 2, social vulnerability. Number 3, economic vulnerability. And number 4, environmental vulnerability. Now, let us have first, number 1, physical vulnerability. This includes population, density levels, place of a settlement, the site design, and materials used for infrastructure and housing. When hazardous events occur, normally physical elements are severely damaged. An example of this is this first image. This is a wooden house that is earthquake safe but vulnerable by fire. Another example. Earlier, the buildings that we show you, those were the buildings that were totally destroyed during the Super Typhoon Yolanda in 2008, leaving the structure totally damaged. And the decrease in population density, like what happened in Baguio during the 1990 earthquake in northern Luzon, when a lot of people were injured and died. Second, vulnerability is the social vulnerability. Social vulnerability happens due to inability of people, organization, and societies to prevent severe effects from hazards because of the expected behavior in social interactions, institutions, and system of cultural values. For example, here is another image. The children are vulnerable to social exploitation, violence, and improper cultural practices because they are living in a poor community. Now, another example is the second image. This image shows that during typhoon, the line of communications were cut off. When cell sites shut down or disrupted, that also the transportation is disrupted. Systems due to inability of small vehicles to pass through the flooded areas or unpassable roads and bridges. With some difficulties in the delivery of services such as relief goods and medicines, a lot of problems occurred, like shortage of food and spread of infectious diseases. Therefore, when social elements were exposed to hazard, this may lead to disruption of normal processes and activities in the community. Now, let us go on to the third vulnerability. This is economic vulnerability. What do we mean by economic vulnerability? This is the level of vulnerability is highly dependent upon the economic status of individuals, communities, and nations. Another definition for economic vulnerability, it is based on the economic status of individuals, communities, and nations. The poorer the country, the more vulnerable to disasters. Why? Why do you think so? This is because they lack the funds or budgets to build sturdy structures and put other engineering measures in place which protect them from being affected by disasters. Social and economic vulnerability can be combined also, and it is known as socio-economic vulnerability. In this third image, this is an image, the community is poor, that's why they are susceptible to hazards and disasters. As you can see, the houses are poorly built and poorly constructed. That's why they are susceptible to hazards and disasters. Number 3, economic vulnerability. Economic vulnerability is the level of vulnerability is highly dependent upon the economic status of individuals, communities, and nations. It is based on the economic status of individuals, communities, and nations. The poorer the country, the more vulnerable to disasters. Why do you think so? This is because they lack the funds or budgets to build sturdy structures and put other engineering measures in place, which protect them from being affected by the disasters. Social economic vulnerability can be combined also. It is known as socio-economic vulnerability. Particularly in the image below, the community is poor, that's why they are susceptible to hazards and disasters. Number 4, environmental vulnerability. This is caused by natural resources depletion and destruction. Organisms like humans, animals, and plants are all dependent on the environment for survival. Human activities like, for example, deforestation, burning of fossil fuels, and kaingin farming affect the natural abilities of the environment to protect itself from any natural hazard. Due to the absence of trees, which may cause landslide and flash floods. Sometimes, the effects are irreversible. The first image, it depicts or represents illegal mining that can be a source of terrestrial and water pollution because of the chemicals that they are going to use in mining. In image number 2, as you can see here below, presents illegal and kaingin farming, which harms the ecosystem and the environment. When the trees are cut off or burned, there will be no shelter for the animals, and there will be no source of food for them also. Now let us compare hazard and risk. When you say hazard, it is something that has the potential to cause harm. While risk, it is the probability that a hazard will cause harm. Here is another comparison showing the differences of hazard and risk. And next is the diagram. Just remember this diagram. The approach, this is what we call the risk triangle. If any of the sides increases, like for example, the exposure, hazard, and vulnerability, then the amount of risk will also increase. Meaning, exposure, hazard, and vulnerability are directly proportional to risk. Now, let us go on to the reasons why Philippines has high vulnerability to disasters. First, it lies in the Pacific Typhoon Belt, and we are visited by an average of 20 typhoons every year. Second, rugged nature of the landscape makes it vulnerable to landslide, mud flows, and other disasters. Third, it is an archipelagic country with many small islands where some areas are at below sea level. Fourth, it has the longest shoreline in the world at about 32,400 kilometers, making it vulnerable to storm surges. Fifth, it is still a primary agricultural and fishing economy. Sixth reason, with poor institutional and social capacity to manage, respond, and recover from natural hazard events. Seventh, with high level of poverty. Eighth, aside from typhoon, it is also at risk to volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and floods. To summarize what we have learned for today, here are the following concepts to remember. Hazard is a harmful condition, substance, human behavior, or condition that can cause loss of life, injury, or other health effects, harm to property, loss of livelihood and services, social and economic disruption, or damage to the environment. Just remember, any risk which is imminent is a threat. Next, exposure is the presence of elements at risk or chance of being harmed from a natural or man-made hazard event. Next, vulnerability means the characteristics and circumstance of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard and inability of a community to prevent, mitigate, prepare for, and respond to hazardous events. And risk. Risk implies the probability of possible adverse effects. This results from the interaction of social and environmental systems, from the combination of physical danger and exposed item vulnerabilities. Now, let us go on for our assessment for today. We have here 5 statements, and you're going to classify which type of vulnerability it is included. Then, key in the letter that corresponds to your answers on the comment section below. Are you ready? Let's start. Number 1. This also often leads to a lack of safety and tend to come hand in hand with natural disasters such as floods, storm, earthquake, and volcanic eruption. A. Physical vulnerability. B. Environmental vulnerability. C. Economic vulnerability. And D. Social vulnerability. And the answer is physical vulnerability. Letter A. Good job! Next question, number 2. When a corporation is insured, it may take on higher risk knowing that its insurance will pay the associated costs. Here are the choices. A. Physical vulnerability. B. Environmental vulnerability. C. Economic vulnerability. And D. Social vulnerability. And the answer is C. Economic vulnerability. You're amazing. Number 3. This occurs when an entity has an incentive to increase its exposure to risk because it does not bear the full cost of that risk. Here are the choices. A. Physical vulnerability. B. Environmental vulnerability. C. Economic vulnerability. And D. Social vulnerability. And the answer is letter D. Social vulnerability. That is correct. Splendid job. Number 4. Natural disasters such as storm and earthquakes. Here are the choices. A. Physical vulnerability. B. Environmental vulnerability. C. Economic vulnerability. And D. Social vulnerability. And the answer is B. Environmental vulnerability. Superb job. And number 5. Limit a population's access to health services, water, food, and transportation, all of which are determinants of health. What do you think the answer is? A. Physical vulnerability. B. Environmental vulnerability. C. Economic vulnerability. And D. Social vulnerability. And the answer is A. Physical vulnerability. Marvelous. I hope you learned from our lesson for today and you have answered our assessment correctly. I'm Proceso B. Binsol III from Vicente P. Trinidad National High School. Now, I'm leaving you with a quote from Czech Republic supermodel Petra Nemkova. And it goes, "We cannot stop natural disasters, but we can arm ourselves with knowledge. So many lives wouldn't have to be lost if there is enough disaster preparedness." So that concludes and ends our lesson for today. Thank you for your time and God bless everyone.